via the web and you're just speaking via phone?
Yes, my laptop is broken, does not have a microphone, and we're waiting to get a new laptop. So
Okay.
I have to dial in on the phone to hear and to speak. But I'm already in the laptop is connected also. So you should see me there.
Yeah, so double check that you can present, because your phone
Yes,
is listed as an attendee, not a presenter. So I want to make sure.
Yeah, right now it's showing that I am not a presenter.
I may have to. Is that also on your laptop or just on your phone?
On my laptop. The phone is just for audio.
Right. Okay. Let's see.
Aha.
Are you a presenter now?
Yes, it's showing me as a presenter. And we were testing this out. And Barbara, can you see that okay?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate the help.
Okay, and I am going to try to present the opening slides. If you will. Let's see. Let's find it. Okay, is the slide up Robin?
Your slide is still, the little circle's still going.
Oh,
It's coming up.
okay. It's up on mine, but
Yeah, that happened with me when I was showing the slides for Angel on Wednesday. I would hit the next slide, but it would take it a while for it to show up beyond my laptop. There it is. It's up now.
okay. Okay, I'll stop presenting now. Is Danelle on yet?
No, she will be. She might be a few minutes late, but that's the whole first part is all me.
Okay. I just wanted to know if we needed to test her as well.
Unfortunately, not at this moment.
Okay. Then the only other person to test will be Joanna. And she's having to reboot, so.
Oh, Barbara, I also had wanted to mention to you that the reason I can't display my image is because of the issues with the laptop. So I don't even have the option to turn the video on.
Sorry, I was muted when I said, okay. Sawadee-ka. Welcome to everyone. Good morning to our friends in Bangkok, and good evening to those of us on the stateside. We are going to get started on session 4. Let me bring up the slides. Oops, that's the wrong one. I'm sorry. We're going to stop that. I'm sorry, I had the slides right here, and for some reason, they went away. Here. Robin, can you see the slides?
No, they flashed for a moment and then they went away.
Okay. Let's see if I can get them back up. Are the slides up yet?
No, don't see anything.
Okay. I don't. Let me see if I can do by sharing screen.
Okay. Now something is showing up.
Okay.
There they are.
Okay, so we'll go with this version of them. Okay. Apologies to everyone we're seem to having difficulty doing presentations tonight. So we hope that we've solved the problem here. Welcome to session 4 of the Thailand National Cybersecurity Agency, Mitre, CISA, and SCI academic training program. Tonight's session is about incident response, resilience, and readiness. The team for this evening from the Software Engineering Institute is Robin Rufo, team lead of CCERT Development and Training Team. And Danelle Castro will be joining us. She's a senior cybersecurity researcher. We also have Joanna Vazana, who is a group leader in our International Cyber Capacity Building Group. And you will remember her from last week's session, and she will bring us another serial day in Mr. Dingbang's day. And I'm Barbara Gruey, the Senior Principal for International Strategy and Policy. And you'll remember from last week, we talked about the conceptual framework for maintaining cybersecurity. And tonight we're going to focus on CCERTs and again on incident response and resiliency. Our agenda for this evening, after we get our objectives this evening, we will talk about incident management's place in operational resilience, the essential role of a CCERT in incident response, CCERT development, preparing the CCERT for action, evaluation, sustainment, and improvement, and then measuring incident response and resiliency readiness, progress, and readiness. Why you should measure it, some models and instruments, and then we'll talk about the MITRE maturity model for incident response and resiliency readiness. Then we will have another session of Mr. Dingbang. Our session's objectives for today are: how does incident response support resilience? What is a computer security incident response team, or CCERT? What is a CCERT's role in incident response? What activities and services does a CCERT provide? What are the steps and components for developing a CCERT? And how and why do you evaluate a CSERT to determine if it's meeting its mission or ready for operation? And once again, keep these objectives in mind. At the end of the session, we'll come back and give you a chance in the Mentimeter polls to tell us whether we met the objectives or not. For tonight, using Mentimeter, we'll put the code in the chat, but this is tonight's code. And at this point, I would like to turn it over to Robin, if she can start presenting her session.
Great, thank you so much, Barbara. And hang on a minute. Couple weird things again. It's that kind of evening, I think, that kind of morning. It's funny because we just had those slides up. I'm having I think the same problem that you might have been having, Barbara, where for some reason the slides are not, All right. Apologize for a minute. Let me try to get things working again. I think I might have gotten thrown out a minute. Okay, no, okay. Try again.
Do you want me to try to put up the slides you sent earlier today?
Yes, let me try one more time. I just can't, I don't understand why all of a sudden it all went away. It's as if other things are showing up, but not the slides. All right, let's try one more time. Okay, got them. That was very strange. Okay. Thank you all for your patience. I apologize very much for that delay. And again, as Barbara said, I'm Robin Ruffel. I'm the team lead for the CSERT development and training team within the Security Operations Group, the CERT division of the Software Engineering Institute. I've been working in this capacity or in this area of incident management for 23 years at the Software Engineering Institute. We've developed some of the very first courses for computer security incident response teams, some of the very first publications, and we also have been doing work with security operations centers, insider threat, and we've been developing assessments and performing those assessments for CSERT and insider threat programs, along with helping organizations look at their training and mentoring modules and how to build a successful training platform. So I'm glad to be with you again after last week. So let's begin to talk about incident response, resilience, and readiness. And what we want to accomplish today in this module is we really want to look at incident response and really the broader incident management process. So you'll hear us talk about the term incident management because it includes many different process components, and we'll show some examples of that. An incident response is just one of the components of incident management. And we'll talk about the fact, though, that very often, because response was the first thing that people started with in incident response, that is still the word people use, even when they mean the broader incident management process. So we want to look at incident response and its connection to incident management in two different ways related to resilience and readiness. One, the fact that incident management as a process supports operational resilience, which we'll talk about, and we'll talk about operational resilience is part of risk management. And so we'll look at how incident management helps us be better prepared. We're also going to talk about the fact that a CSERT or whatever other entity is performing the incident management process, because there are many different names that people use for the different organizations. And we feel it's most important what the actual activities, functions, or services are, not the name, because the names are so different. But we want to also look tonight and this morning as far as what are the resilience and readiness requirements that need to be in place so that you have a prepared team. What does that include? What are the specific components? And later on in this presentation, Danelle is going to tell us about some of those components. And remember, in this module, we're looking at things from a high level. So we're hitting a lot of these important key concepts, but you could dig down into them to a lot greater detail. So let's start off with incident management and its place in operational resilience. And if we define incident management, we're looking at that ability to provide the end-to-end management of events and incidents across the enterprise. And in that case, the enterprise could be a particular business, it could be a particular critical infrastructure, or it could be a whole country or economy. So we're looking at that ability to manage events and incidents that are going to affect our key assets within our organization or our sector or our broader country. We want to make sure that this is done in a standardized, high-quality fashion, that we know what we're doing and we have the right people, processes, technologies, and facilities in place to do that. And that is going to tie into the resilience aspect that we mentioned. Another way to define incident management comes from the NIST Special Publication 861 Revision 2, which we mentioned last week when we looked at National Cyber Incident Response Plan. And in this special publication, which is Computer Security Incident Handling Guide, it also lays out what are the different parts of incident management. So it goes through that incident management life cycle, but you'll notice that one of the key ones we mentioned is that preparation. And we actually talked about preparation last week when we talked about the things that you need to do to put a national incident response plan in place. So let's look at this a little bit more, that preparation piece and how important that is. Because when you look at it realistically, incident management, incident response starts before you ever have an incident to handle. You want to make sure that you have in place what you're going to need to be able to do the rest of these processes, detect that there's some malicious or suspicious or threatening activity, analyze what it is, and look at the scope and look at who's affected. When we were talking about defining incident criteria and the types of data you would collect when you're reporting an incident, so being able to collect that information and analyze it, that means you have to have the right tools and storage and processes in place for that, and people who have the right expertise. The same with the response component, being able to have and know what am I allowed to do to contain something, what are my options for eradication, who do I have to work with or turn over the recovery to actually return things to normal state. And then also the processes for collecting lessons learned, for identifying strengths and weaknesses of the process and the plan that's in place. So being able to evaluate how well things went and where there's a need for improvement. So when we look at preparation, we're saying you want to have as much of that in place ahead of time. You do not want to try to figure out those things, the escalation path, the tools you have, while you're trying to handle a serious incident. Now, that's not to say that you can be ready for everything. There has to be some flexibility. You are going to run into things that you don't know or aren't expecting. And so you have to think about that too in your preparations. But we're really talking about looking and thinking about the types of incidents that you expect to have, how they change over time, and what you need as far as facilities, processes, technologies, people, in your overall policies and procedures and standard operating procedures. Without having that good foundation, you're going to limit what you can do to do that containment, eradication, and recovery. And this diagram shows that a little bit better. This takes those components that we looked at in the NIST processes and breaks them out to an even more granular level. And you can see all the different things that are part of the incident management life cycle, the monitoring through detection, the initial analysis of what is this, what is priority, what's the severity, the more additional analysis that may include malware analysis or forensics analysis or business impact analysis, and then coming up with courses of action for mitigation, response, and then the recovery. So we see that life cycle. And here's where you can really see the difference between the respond part and the incident management part. But very often, and I know it can be confusing, people switch the terms or use the terms interchangeably. And that's because incident management, that term kind of came along as we understood the whole process better. We started saying incident response, and it's hard for everyone to let go of that term. You also notice in the middle of this diagram, it breaks the prepare part out a little bit more. So all the things that we have to have in place, do we know our policies? Do we know our escalation path? That can include our disclosure policies. Who are we allowed to tell information to? It can be our communication plan and policies, and certainly our incident management plan in place. But also evaluating and seeing how it goes while we're handling incidents, being able to identify improvements to those processes, and making sure that the high level of preparation can be sustained, including the sustainment of our staff. And so that improvement and sustainment as part of prepare is also tying into the resilience aspects. And here again, we talk about what is it we're trying to accomplish. And it's the speed with which an organization can recognize, analyze, and respond to an incident limits the damage done and lowers the cost of recovery. So that statement is very important, because that is what incident management allows us to do. It becomes part of that resilience of our organization, that we can quickly identify threats, that we can quickly identify attacks, and that we can figure out what's happening, what's affected, and what can we do to limit the damage and lower that cost of recovery. So what can we do to contain, eradicate, and recover? So now we'd like to go to our first Mentimeter question. And if you would go to the menti.com website and enter the code that's below. And we would like to ask you your thoughts about how you think incident response or incident management supports resilience. And so I will stop sharing so that so that Joanna can bring up our Mentimeter responses.
Thanks, Robin. I'm actually having the same screen share issue as I think you and Barbara. So I'm going to try something here from my phone, and I think Barbara is also going to try, and we're going to see who gets our screen shared first. Just 1 second.
Okay.
I clicked present, and I tried to. Is that showing by chance?
It is not.
Okay. Let's see if I can do it this way. Is that by chance showing?
Not yet.
So I will give some verbal responses because I can see the information coming in. I just can't get it to share from my phone. But we have a few responses. Roles and responsibilities, reduce impact, recover quickly, prioritization, real problems, preparation, and then we've got a pause, so we'll give everyone a minute to add. Faster and more efficient. Better. Sorry, go ahead, Robin. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, okay, those are some good responses from people talking about how that, we're trying to be able to figure out what the problems are and respond faster so that our key assets are not in danger longer, so that we can get them up and running so we can execute our mission. I like the one about prioritization also, helping to prioritize and escalate that response effort. Were there any other ones you wanted to bring up, Joanna?
Let's see what else has come in. You know what? Let's see. We've got sharing information, quick response, and that looks like that.
Good. And that sharing information, that's another good one from the discussion that was last Tuesday. Also, being able to let other people know, once you know, that could help them take that information before they're affected and potentially protect or prevent an incident from hitting their infrastructure. Okay. I am going to try to share again now. Fingers crossed. All right. Working. Can you see the slides okay?
They're coming up. You're good.
Good. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about incident management and its role in operational resilience. A good way that we like to show that connection is we talk about the CERT Resilience Management Model, also called CERT RMM. And this is a model, is a process-focused model, which contains guidelines and practices. And it looks at the convergence of IT operations, business continuity, and security operations. And when this first started, the way that the people at CERT built this, they went out and they pulled together a lot of people from the financial services industry, from the credit card companies, from banks, and they actually began to start to talk to them about, what was needed for resilience in their own operation. And out of it, they built the resilience management model that covers 26 plus process areas. And the resilience management model focuses on kind of a higher level, what do you need to have in place, not all the detail of how you implement each piece of it. But one of the models is actually called, or one of the processes, is actually called Incident Management and Control, IMC, basically incident management. And it is identified as a risk management activity, specifically an activity related to operational risk. So in this case, incident management is trying to reduce operational risk by having your plans and preparations, tools, infrastructure components for cyber defenses, right people all in place. And it's foundational to managing the security and resilience of those assets and business processes within an organization. And when we look at the specific type of operational risk, we talk about this operational resilience. And this is the organization's ability to sustain the mission in the face of risk. So that's why you'll see us talk about this kind of like coil, because if you take a coil and you stretch it and then leave it go, it will go back to its normal shape. And so that coil is resilient in that case. And so we're talking about an organization not just to be survivable from threats and attacks, but resilient. And so that they are able to return back to normal operations to execute the mission. Survivability may mean I made it through the incident, but I'm not back to my normal operations. So this resilience emerges from having good risk management, which we talked about on the very first day, how important risk management components are. And in this case, we're talking about if we have effective incident management, we have our preparations and plans in place, we can do all the things that you listed in the Mentimeter responses, we get better operational resilience, meaning our organization has a better opportunity to be able to make it through the incidents and return to normal level of operations. It's resilient. It's able to make it back to being able to execute its full mission. And if we look a little bit more at the CERT RMM incident management and control process, you'll start to see so many of the things we talked about in the definitions earlier in this module: detecting, analyzing, responding to, learning from incidents. So all of these different pieces are laid out as goals that you want to have in your process. And notice that the definition of an incident, though, within this context is very broad. It can relate to cybersecurity incidents, but it can also relate to other disruptions. So the CERT RMM model is not just focused on cyber disruptions. It also looks at other disruptions. And I just mentioned that so you'll have that context, but it's really the fact that this is one of the resilience processes. And just this is CERT RMM at a glance, the 26 process areas. There's been a few additional ones. You can see under operations management, not only is incident management there, but vulnerability analysis is also there. Some things that we see from information assurance, access management, identity management. And then there's things such as enterprise management. You'll see financial resource management, human resource management. So a lot of different things, including training and risk management, that are very important. And so this again shows us that incident management does not stand alone or stand in isolation as a process. And you're going to hear us say that multiple times throughout the session with different diagrams and different texts. In the CERT RMM, it also works hand in hand with service continuity, which is basically business continuity, compliance and what has to be in place for compliance, monitoring to ensure things are done at a quality level. That's not monitoring that is like network monitoring. And then vulnerability analysis and resolution. And again, those things I mentioned, communications, organizational training, and awareness. So how all of these processes work, we need to look at how incident management aligns with these and passes potentially information between the different processes. And so together, we begin to build those resilience aspects of an organization. So that really shows how incident management is part of that. So tying it all together, with incident management, it allows us to identify those threats and risks. And then it allows us to have that preparation in place, those response processes to enable that faster execution. And that having that in place, ensuring it's effective, ensuring it's performing the right activities and meeting success, meaning you have to evaluate it, can result in that higher level of operational resilience. And having formalized incident management processes includes having underlying plans, policies, and procedures. And that's all part of that preparation. All the things you need to have in place to ensure your incident management capability is ready.
It's very cute.
Robin, is this where Danelle takes over, or are you still trying to speak? Unfortunately, I think Robin has momentarily been disconnected. Tracy?
Yes, give us just a moment. I'm checking in with her.
Okay, thank you. Apologies for, we seem to be having a fair share of some technical challenges this evening.
I believe she's trying to. Okay, so she's saying that it's telling her she's muted.
Okay, let me find her and see if I can unmute her. She's usually at the top. I don't even see her. We just got a note from someone that Microsoft Teams apparently has some challenges after an update this morning. So we may just have bad timing. Unfortunately, Tracy, I don't even see her phone here. I only see her online piece.
I see it under, if you click, so it's listed under attendees instead of presenters.
Okay, let me look at that.
I think it's on there twice, so I'm not sure.
Okay. Let me. I unfortunately, it shows. Let me see if I can see them. I don't know. Maybe Matt Chapman's been very helpful this evening, helping some of the rest of the people get this right. Do you have any recommendations? Meanwhile, Tracy's, can Danelle get going and can she do this part?
Just a moment, I'm checking.
While you're doing that, I'll go ahead and pass along that we saw the message also that there was a app update to Teams. If you just run it through the browser, it'll bypass
we already have to run it through the browser because we're not
Great.
allowed to connect to another organization's Teams app.
I certainly can brief this section for Robin until she.
Yeah, could you please go ahead, Danelle, and
Absolutely. So we're going to talk about right now the role of a CSIRT in incident response, which is pretty much important. Next slide, please. So let's go to our next Mentimeter question. Joanna, I believe that you are running that. So what do you think is a CSIRT's role in incident response? And I'm not sharing my slides, so we might need a verbal response from you, Joanna, about what kind of answers we're getting from folks.
Okay, let me try this again. It looks like I'm sharing. You're not seeing the responses yet, I take it?
No, ma'am, not yet.
Okay, try this one more.
No worries, we'll get there.
We'll try this one more time quickly, and if it does not work, we will just do verbal responses.
I think we need to call Mr. Dingbang.
I think we need to.
Sure.
Any luck now?
No, ma'am.
No. Okay. All right. Well, in the interest of time, I will narrate. So we have, they are a leader, reducing the impact of incidents, sharing and collaboration, main center and response agency, forensics, analysis, identifying risk and leading operations.
Now we see it.
Ah, okay. So there's just a long delay, maybe.
Actually, that's my screen.
Oh,
I'm sharing my screen.
Okay. So Robin, you can see our results here. A lot of really good points. Collection, analyzation, processing, reporting, response and sharing information, managing security issues. Teams play a major role in performing incident response.
What I really like about these responses is, and we're going to talk about it later, when we talk about developing a CSERT, it really comes down to who your constituency is or your stakeholders are. And it can be any of these things. And it really comes down to what resources you have, what your mission is, what your goals are. And again, who are you serving? What are you trying to accomplish? So a CSERT can be as big as you want it to be. It can encompass many, many services. Or if you're starting off, we can narrow that scope until you're ready to have more resources or the expertise. So all of this is really spot on. I think we can go back to the briefing. Thank you.
And that's what we call resiliency.
For sure. Thank you, Barbara. I apologize. I don't see any slides. So Robin,
Give us a
thank
second.
you. Great. We will.
You may have the same problem as last time.
Tracy, do you want me to pull up the slides and display them?
Yeah, you might want to have them ready just in case. This Robin was sharing, but we may need to save the Mentimeter questions till the end.
I see Robin is unmuted now.
Let's try again. Robin? Robin, were you able to unmute? All right.
So for those in Thailand, I know it's your Tuesday, but this is our Monday. And we always count on something going wrong on a Monday.
Barbara, if you happen to have the slides ready, maybe since yours was working.
Yeah, which slide? Let me find the right slide. And we're on 22?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Let me share my screen. Okay. I'm on slide 22.
Thank you so much, Barbara. So what are strategies for an effective response, or what do you want your incident response team to have in their tool chest, if you will? I think one of the biggest challenges for organizations, especially if you're a CSERT that works specifically for an organization, is identifying what your key assets are, understanding what your inventory is, what is your footprint. So how many servers do you have? How many domains do you have? Who among your teams have admin privileges, and is your network segmented? Another key point to an effective response is, are you going to look at your risk? What is your risk? In order to do that, you have to do risk assessments, identify your gaps. And for an organization, not just identifying gaps, but understanding the costs for closing those gaps. It may be that your organization isn't prepared to pay for the cost for closing gaps. However, it's still incumbent upon the incident risk CSIRT to identify what risks there are, inform leadership, and allow leadership to make educated decisions about what they're willing to pay for and what they want to secure. Another important part of effective response is what I call proactive response. So what you can do before you even have to respond to an incident, which frankly includes identifying key assets and risk assessments. But I think one of the things that's a big win, an easy win, is providing security training to users, all employees. It's a simple thing to do, but it's not, if it's not followed up with, if your users aren't held accountable, if the training isn't reinforced annually or required, it may not be useful. But for example, any one of us can receive an email. It could be a whaling campaign, a phishing campaign. It only takes one user to click the link or to open up the attachment, right? And then we are now all compromised. Another part is to define what your defensive measures are. How are you going to shrink your attack surface? There's a lot of cost involved in this. You need resources to include human expertise as well as tools, and that is costly for an organization. It kind of goes back to what your key assets are and what your leadership is willing to spend on the security of its company. Formalizing the incident process, the incident management process. So I would just like to drive home that there's a difference between your response capability and your management process, which Robin talked about earlier. Your management process should be already in place. You already should have your playbooks. You should know what your service level agreements are. So if there is an incident, your employees who are now on the response side of the incident, looking at the data, looking at the logs, they should know when they have to report, who they have to report to, and how much time they have. That's part of your incident management process. Another part of your incident management process might also include reporting to your legal team or reporting to regulators or law enforcement. Keeping systems patched, it's similar for me to providing training. It's an easy thing to do, but is oftentimes overlooked. We saw that with Equifax, and we need to understand what software is running on our networks, and then whether or not those software products are vulnerable. And if they're vulnerable, are they being attacked? That's very, very important. And that's part of your vulnerability management. Whether or not that's part of your CSIRT, that could be part of your CSIRT, or it could be a team that works in concert with your CSIRT. Next slide, please.
Yes. As I do that, one thing I'd like to point out is those first two items, identifying key assets and performing risk assessments. We talked about those in detail in session 1.
Thank you, Barbara. Yes, we did.
We're on slide 24.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So incident management does not stand alone. It's part of the security or information assurance or information security lifecycle. And there's a lot of really good information in open source about what that security lifecycle should look like. And the NIST cybersecurity framework, I feel like, really breaks it down in easy to understand and digest section. So first you identify, for example, you identify your assets, you identify your business environment. What are your key business objectives? What is the governance for your company? Have you done risk assessments against your assets and your key business environments? And what is your risk management strategy? I mean, that's really important. It's not as easy as it sounds. You protect. So do you have access controls in place? So for example, those folks who have administrative access to your network, are you monitoring them more closely than you are others? Do you disallow access? Do you have a need to know policy in place? Is your network segmented? Awareness and training, it's an easy win, but oftentimes overlooked by companies. Awareness and training for all, and especially those who might be targets of particular phishing campaigns. So oftentimes we see human resources targeted or our accounting offices targeted. Those people who have the ability to, for example, write the checks or transfer money, they will be targets of cyber criminals. And oftentimes we see this with what they call business email compromise campaigns, where they might, a threat actor might say, pretend to be the chief executive officer of a company and create some urgency with an email saying, I need you to write this invoice immediately. Somebody who works in accounting, who has the ability to write the check, sees an email that is spoofed, but is unaware of the spoof, that it was spoofed, and writes the check. And we've seen, in my previous position, I worked for a bank, we've seen smaller companies go out of business because of these attacks. So training that specifically targets those users who would be targets of these criminals is really, really important. Data security, are you going to enforce encryption? Are you going to enforce encryption of data at rest? Are you going to enforce email transfer encryption? Maintenance of your networks. It kind of goes back to the updating for vulnerabilities. Do you know what's running on your network? Are you allowing rogue devices? By rogue devices, do you know when something connects to your network that you have not explicitly approved? So has someone used their computer to charge their personal phone? That would be considered a rogue device. Has someone connected a printer to the network that was not approved by your information technology department? That is considered a rogue device and could be an attack vector for your business. Detecting is probably one for a CSERT is probably one of the hardest things, because there is just so much information coming at your network. So how do you identify what is normal activity versus what is not normal activity? What is anomalous? And especially now that we are virtual employees and most of us are connecting via a virtual private network, a VPN. When do you see something connecting that via VPN that shouldn't be? We talked about this, I think, a little bit last week. So if you have staff primarily in normal business hours from a place like Alaska, that should raise some red flags. And you should dig into that. But your analysts, because there is so much network activity, should have that alerted to them front and center. For example, if there's activity outside of your normal business hours, that again warrants some additional investigation. Another question or component a company deciding or an organization deciding to stand up a CSERT should consider is whether you want continuous monitoring. Are you going to do 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year? Do you have the resources to support that? If you do not, do you want to hire an outside company to provide that for you? Response is where it really gets real, if you will. Your responders are, I often say, are on the front lines of your defense. they are responding to something that is not good. They need to have the proper policies, procedures, playbooks at the ready. They need that at their fingertips. They cannot be trying to figure that out or plan it while they're trying to respond to an incident. Their primary goal is to detect a threat, contain the threat, mitigate and eradicate the threat. That is their primary goal. Communications comes with that, but I would argue the communications of their actions really kind of leads back into that incident management. Your responders really have to be firewalled from the need to report up and to provide leadership updates, because they are really inside the data. They're looking at your network traffic. They're looking at your packet capture traffic. They're looking at your user logins. These men and women are having to assess information very quickly and make decisions very quickly in order to protect the assets on their network. So the communications is critical for leadership, it's critical for law enforcement, it's critical for regulators, but I would argue have a separate team responsible for that so that your incident responders can focus on their response. Recovering should also be part of your plan. You need to have that already built in. It should be in your playbook. It should include what type of reporting goes to your leadership, and it should include whether or not you have a timeline for recovery. So once you've contained a threat, how much time are you allowed to get to business as usual? And this ties right back into what Robin was talking about as far as business continuity and resiliency. Once you've done these things for a specific incident, it is really, really important to have an after action report or a meeting where you discuss how could we have done better. What I will say in my past experience is your responders are under a lot of pressure. I've seen a lot of burnout in that area because they are dealing with something that is real, could impact the reputation of your organization. It could impact your ability to provide a service. It could lead to national news coverage. So they have a lot of responsibility on their shoulders. What needs to happen after they've contained, mitigated, and responded to a threat, everyone should come back to the table and talk about how could we have supported our responders better? How could we have helped them respond faster? What tools do we need? How many additional resources do we need? And how do we communicate this to our leadership so they understand the importance of a very robust CSIRT capability? Next slide, please.
Danelle, we're going to go ahead and take the break so that we can try to work through the technical challenges.
Very well, thank you.
Okay, so we will take a 10-minute break right now. It's 10 a.m. and we'll come back at 10 minutes after 10. And thank you again for all your patience as we try to resolve some of these technical difficulties. Robin, are you able to be unmuted? I show you as unmuted.
สวัสดีค่ะแซงตัวแทนสกมชนะคะ พอดีว่าจะรบกวนเวลาพักเบรกของท่านสักเล็กน้อยนะคะ ค่ะสำหรับวันนี้นะคะ ถ้าท่านใดติดปัญหาใดๆในการประชุมนี้นะคะ สามารถแจ้งผ่านทางแอดมินผ่านทางไลน์ได้นะคะ หรือว่าผ่านทางแชททีมงานได้เลยค่ะ ขอบคุณค่ะ
It's 10:10. If we can go back, Rick, if you'll stop displaying the scenario slides, and we can go back to the regular slides. And do we have?
Yeah, I'm trying to. It won't let me stop displaying.
I'm going to take control.
Yeah, just take control.
I'm going to stop presenting. That stops the presentation for everyone. I'm going to go back up to the other slides. And Tracy, do we have either Danelle or Robin ready to present again?
I think I'm going to take the next few slides, and then
Okay.
Danelle will pick back up in just a few slides.
Okay.
So,
I have slide 25 up. Is that where you want to be?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay.
So welcome back from the break. Again, apologies for all of the technical challenges. I will cover the next few slides since Robin is having difficulty with the audio portion. As Danelle was already, she has already gone over the different portions of the NIST cybersecurity framework, so I won't spend much time on this slide in particular, but just take a look at each of the 5 categories that make up the response portion of the framework. And these are some of the pieces that we will talk about again later. Next slide. So when you start to set up your incident management capability, there are a variety of different ways to do so. Some organizations assigned this particular function to a group within the organization. That's when you tend to hear the term Computer Security Incident Response Team, or CSIRT. They have that team specifically designated within their organization. But then other organizations, especially perhaps those with fewer resources, may function in more of a matrixed approach where they have to pull experts from several teams to come together to respond to an incident. And you'll see CSIRTs in designated groups in a variety of places, so not just corporations and national CSIRTs, but you'll see them in your local and state governments and academia as well. Next slide. I probably spoke ahead. Here on this slide, we talk about some of the organizations that, perhaps the incident response functions are performed by a variety of other staff. So sometimes it's designated individuals from your IT department or risk management staff. And this is more common in the commercial industry, and you'll see incident response sometimes being just one function of a security operations center rather than being its own separate team, or perhaps the function is performed by one of these other types of teams that are listed. And then there's a completely different third scenario where you just don't have the personnel or personnel with the expertise to do it, but you still need the function performed, and so you outsource it to another organization. Next slide. So we've tossed around the term CSIRT quite a bit today, but really what do we mean when we talk about a CSIRT? It's really an organization or capability that is providing services and support to a defined constituency, and we'll talk about constituencies in just a moment. But what they're overall focused on is preventing, handling, and responding to those computer security incidents. A good analogy, as you see in the cartoon graphic, is similar to a fire department. There's an aspect of fire department services that is the prevention, so educating others on the stop, drop, and roll, and things such as smoke detectors and ways to detect and prevent fires. But then if the fire does occur, then they have, another set of functions that they perform for responding and eliminating the fire. So a CSIRT is very similar in the cyber incident realm. Next slide. So some of the benefits of a CSIRT. One very important benefit is that it provides rapid, standardized, and coordinated response activities. As Robin and Angel spoke about last week with the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, there's the importance of having the processes determined in advance so everyone knows what they're supposed to do and how they should respond to an incident and who's going to do what as part of the response activities. And especially in those organizations that have a designated team to perform the incident response functions, that centralized point of contact, everyone knows who will lead coordination and who will be in charge of disseminating information related to incident response actions. Another very important aspect is the last bullet. I believe we've touched on in some of the other sessions, trust, especially regarding information sharing. And it's important when it comes to incident response actions because having other incident response teams in the community that are aware of your team, know what functions you're providing, and can trust your ability to coordinate and collaborate and share information about incidents will help in your own response activities because they will be more willing to work with you in the time of an incident. Next slide. Some of the things that a CSIRT does, and we'll talk in just a moment about the variety of options, but some of the more common things that most CSIRTs do. They, as I said on the previous slide, they provide a single point of contact for reporting problems. So especially in the case of a national CSIRT, other citizens and other government organizations know that they are the central focal point and know how to contact them. They can provide the analysis that's needed to determine the impact of the threat. And, in addition to identifying and analyzing an incident, it's very important to know how to respond to it or how are you going to resolve the problem. And so having the ability to find solutions and develop mitigation strategies, and then also to be able to disseminate that information to others that might need it as well. Building awareness is another function that a CSIRT might provide, providing awareness, cybersecurity awareness within the organization that it resides, as well as perhaps externally in the case of a an incident response team that's part of a financial institution, perhaps their awareness efforts involve providing that type of education to their customers, where a national CSIRT might have responsibility to do that with all of the citizens of the country. And they might be involved in vulnerability assessments or correlating data for more situational awareness. And in tomorrow's session, some of that coordination will be discussed a little bit further, and so that's an important role. The highlighted portion on this slide is something to definitely keep in mind, because as organizations work on establishing an incident response team, they tend to become overwhelmed with the amount of responsibility or types of services that they could potentially provide. And so it's important to keep in mind during that process that you can't do everything and you can't be everything to everyone. So we always recommend that you start small and grow over time. Don't try to do it all at once. And you also can't compare yourself to other incident response teams and decide that you're going to develop yours in the exact same way that they've developed theirs, because they may have a different mission, a different organization structure, things that work for them and might not be applicable to you. Next slide. So speaking about some of the things that a CSIRT can do, the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, or FIRST, the member organizations of FIRST have worked on a CSIRT services framework. This is currently the 2.1 version, the graphic version of it. If you go to the website that's listed, you'll see a lot more detail about each of the different service areas. But the 5 service areas, they're around the circle: vulnerability management, situational awareness, knowledge transfer, information security, event management, and information security incident management are the 5 top level service areas that that the groups have determined are the most common services that CSIRTs provide. And then within each one of these, you can drill down further into additional functional areas. For example, under information security and incident management, there's a list of additional functions and services that could be provided. So it's understood that there really is not a CSIRT in the world that provides every service that's possible. The goal is to determine, based on your mission and those that you're providing the services to, what services are needed and what are best for your organization to provide. And we'll talk about that again in just a moment. Next slide. So we've also mentioned a couple of different types of CSIRTs over some of the previous slides. So we take just a little bit closer look at some of those. For many of you, an internal or organizational team may be appropriate because it would be serving to address incidents within your own organization. And as the NCSA is working to stand up a national CSIRT, national CSIRTs support a variety of constituents as well, perhaps just government organizations. Other national CSIRTs cover government organizations and critical infrastructure. Others include both of those, plus the the country's citizens as far as cybersecurity awareness. So it really depends on the mission, but they are the central focal point for the country. Regional CSIRTs in Thailand's region, there is the Asia Pacific CERT, which brings together CSIRTs in the region for training and exercises and collaboration. So it helps to build coordination amongst CSIRTs within a particular region. Then we have product security incident response teams. So those are your companies that and your vendors that provide products. And as we all know, many of those frequently have vulnerabilities. And so PCERTs work to identify and mitigate those. And then as we've seen in the last couple of years, there's a lot of movement from those that already had national CSIRTs to start expanding and building out coordination centers or cybersecurity centers where perhaps the national CSIRT is just one component, but there are others that become part of that team in order to broaden the coordination. And we have information sharing and analysis centers, especially in the US, and we'll talk about those more tomorrow. And then earlier when I mentioned that you might need to outsource your incident response function, managed service providers are usually the ones that perform those types of functions. Next slide. So we have another Mentimeter question. So if you would like to try to enter your answer with what type of CSIRTs does your organization participate? And if we need to, Joanna, you can read the answers if we don't want to risk sharing.
Let me see if I can pull up. Oh, hold on. Let me. There.
There we go.
Cool.
Excellent. We can see it.
Yep.
Thanks, Barbara. Okay, Tracy, hopefully you can see the responses coming in?
Yes.
Okay.
Right, so I see that right now it's pretty close between just the internal or organizational team and then sector CSIRTs, which would make sense for this audience of critical infrastructure organizations. I do see a few for national CSIRT as well, which is good that you're starting to participate with the national CSIRT, and there are a couple of you that are involved with regional CSIRT.
While we're waiting for the responses, Tracy, in the chat, we have a question about ISAC can be considered as one type of CSIRT as well. It's just only sharing information and some analysis. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, and I think Danelle has answered that for the most part, and I'll just expand, and we'll talk about it a little bit tomorrow in tomorrow's session as well. But a lot of times it comes down to the functions. I like to tell people not to get too wrapped around which name you're using. For us in some of our work with sectors, we tend to use the term sector CSIRT, especially if they plan to provide incident response types of functions and services. But if it's an ISAC that is also providing incident response. So we know that some of the more mature ISACs, even though their name is all about information sharing and in collaboration, they also do incident response coordination, or they provide mitigation recommendations. So they may not provide on-site assistance to their members, but they may provide information about how to best mitigate a situation that's impacting the sector. So not all of them would consider themselves an incident response team if they are truly only sharing information about incidents that others are responding to, but then there are some that will provide some of those extra services. They just may not refer to themselves as an incident response team. All right, so I think their numbers stayed pretty close between internal organizational teams and sector CSIRTs. So that's good. We'll go back to the slides now.
Okay. Oops. Let me see what I can bring up. There we are. Okay, we're on slide 35, is that correct?
Yes, thank you.
Tracy, this is where I'm ready unless you want to continue.
Yep, is this where you pick up?
Yes, ma'am.
Sure, go for it.
So we've talked a lot about resiliency and readiness, and your CSIRT team has to be prepared in advance. I believe last week we talked about the need for work to happen before an incident, right? So that's where it matters. It can't happen when an incident or a crisis is occurring. I think the biggest takeaways on this slide are obviously be prepared in advance, have your playbooks, have your processes and procedures, know your service level agreements, know who you need to be reporting to and when, and you need to know what your backup plans are. And that includes a surge support. So in my private sector experience, we did have surge support capability, which we had to outsource. So if we suffered a major denial of service attack, there would be someone that could flip the switch, if you will, and maintain operations for our business environment. So I worked for a bank. So the goal was, for whatever incident we were dealing with, the bank's business never suffered. And that was a big deal. That was one of our primary goals in our mission statement. And in order to do this, you have to have all the appropriate and required components in place. And that's a lot of work on the front end, a lot of testing, a lot of evaluation, a lot of buy-in from your leadership. Next slide, please. So where do you begin when you are talking about building a CSIRT? Well, I think the most important question to ask is, and this was in the chat with White. So who are your constituents, right? Who are your stakeholders? Are you a sector CSIRT, a national CSIRT? I started working for the United States CERT, US CERT, where we didn't really do incident response, but what we did do is we coordinated response activities across the U.S. government agencies. So if USDA, the United States USDA or the Department of State had an issue, US CERT, where I worked, would come in and help coordinate a response effort. Were we responsible for eradicating, and mitigating a threat? No. We were more responsible for that information sharing component so that other agencies didn't fall victim to the same threat actor. And another key component for where to begin is, I think the workflow is really important. It's not fun, but it's so important. How do you know what you need to report to whom and when? And what is that response and notification strategy? So again, what are you reporting? Who are you reporting it to? What do they want to know? What do they need to know? And then finally, you need to have, we're going to talk about this in a bit, but your staff and process plans. So short-term, mid-term, long-term plan, this all drives your mission. And that allows you to manage expectations not only for your leadership, but for those you're serving, your stakeholders or your constituents. Next slide, please. Next slide. So who are you serving? Who are your stakeholders? Who is your constituency? If you're a national CSIRT, you're probably in more of a coordination, information sharing role. So if you're at a national level, you might want to know, okay, did the military get affected by some sort of attack? And did the contractors who support the military get impacted by some sort of attack? Or did our financial sector as a whole get impacted? What does that mean worldwide? So the US financial sector might have been impacted. What does that mean? What does it mean for Asia? Were they also impacted? Could we have seen this coming if we shared information more liberally? I don't know. That's something you might want to answer. But if you're an organizational CSIRT, absolutely your primary goal is to make sure there's no disruption to business, loss of data, or disruption to your ability to provide services, or degradation to your reputation. Next slide, please. Strategic partners are important, but oftentimes not on the front and center priority list, but they are important. So even within, if you are an organizational CSIRT, so you're responding to incidents within your own company and you're helping to maintain business continuity and maintain the reputation of your company, in that case, your strategic partners are going to be your human resources, your people who do the legal and compliancy, and the people who are your forward-facing teams. So the ones who are on the social media and the ones who are answering questions about why someone can't get into their account. So you have to be working with those people in advance of an incident to say, hey, if there's an issue and it's going to create a problem, not just for the business part, but for you as the communications director, as your legal team, as the human resources team, let's work out what that's going to all look like and the reporting is going to look like before something bad happens. Next slide, please. And of course, all of this leads into what is your mission statement? So what is your scope of services? What are your goals? You have to manage expectations of not only your organization, but those that you might be partnering with outside your organization. So that means you have to explain the purpose of your team and highlight the core objectives and goals of your team. If you're a national CSERT, you're not going to probably be doing myopic incident response activities. So you're not going to be looking at network activity. You're not going to be looking at packet capture data or who accessed what account and network segment. You're going to be taking the information that you're getting provided, analyzing it and providing it for others who might benefit from that information as well. Next slide, please. This is a big one. How do you fund your CSERT? And again, it goes back to what is it that your CSERT is going to do? And if you're a national level CSERT, that's probably going to be a member-based charge, right? So it goes back to kind of like an ISAC, which I think Wyatt's mentioned in the chat. So, and that's probably more of an information sharing role. So if you want to participate in that kind of CSERT or information sharing group, you have to pay. If you are working for an organization and your organization has charged you with monitoring and protecting their network from incidents, then you're a cost center. So you have to make sure that they understand you need so much money to pay for tools and resources to detect, mitigate, and eradicate threats from their organization. But there are lots of different ways to fund the version of a CSERT that you are going to provide, which basically ties back into the mission statement. Next slide, please. I believe Robin talked a little bit about this earlier, and I think we talked about it a little bit last week. So as a CSERT, you have to define what services you will provide, but not only what services you will provide, also the range of services within that you will provide. So let's take vulnerability management, which is kind of one of my favorites. So you're going to, as a CSERT, say, we're going to do vulnerability management. Okay, what does that mean? Are you going to research vulnerabilities and discover and report on them? Are you going to do analysis on those vulnerabilities? Does that vulnerability management umbrella include understanding what your company's key assets are? Is the company required to report to you what the assets are, how those assets are changing, if the business environment is changing, how much authority and power does your vulnerability management team have? Or what if someone introduces a rogue device? I talked about this a little bit a while ago. So is the vulnerability management team allowed to kick out a rogue device? So if someone connects their cell phone that's not company approved, and the vulnerability management team does, as part of their level of support, scans the network and looks at endpoints and says, wait, this is not something that we accepted or anticipated would be on our network. We have the authority to kick that item off the network. So that goes back to your level of support, your range of services is very important. You have to understand what your authority is, how much funding you have, what your level of expertise are with insofar as your human resources and your tools. Don't extend yourself too far, because you don't want people to think you're capable of doing more than you actually can based on your tools, your resources, your funding. Next slide, please. So when you select services, obviously you have to understand the type of CSERT you are. Are you a national CSIRT? If you're a national CSIRT, you're probably more likely providing an information sharing, coordination, collaboration capability. If you work for an organization directly, you are really responsible for making sure that organization can keep up its business functions, right? You are a key part of their ability to maintain resiliency and to provide the services to their customers that they have and those customers are paying for. So when we talk about resiliency as a CSIRT, if you're an organizational CSIRT, you must be resilient, because if you're not, your business lines might suffer, which might drive your business out of business. That's not going to be a good thing. Next slide, please. When you talk about, what type of CSIRT you are, of course, you need to talk about the, the organizational model and how that model best serves your stakeholders or your constituents. Do you want it to be a distributed or centralized model? Do you perform services or do you act as a coordinator? I would argue, again, as a national CSIRT, you're acting more as a coordinator and facilitation of discussions and sharing of information. But at an organizational level, you're truly responsible for detecting, mitigating, and eradicating a threat. Next slide, please. And the authority. I really like this slide. It's really important because, again, if you're at the national level, you're probably going to be more diplomatic and trying really hard to bring what we say in America, birds of a feather, where we bring people together who have similar interests, or if we're in the same sector, and we talk about our what we're struggling with and what we need help with. But if you're a CSIRT within an organization, you might want to push for authority to maybe kick someone off the network if they haven't done their required training, or be able to deal directly with a business line that hasn't implemented the security that is needed in order to continue services. So really, it goes back to, this really ties back into resiliency for your organization and what your CSIRT capabilities and resources are, and who your champions are. Are they going to back you up and say, look, no, if you haven't taken your required security awareness training, you don't get access to the network. You get basic access. Beyond that, no. That goes back to what authority the CSIRT has, and that's something you're going to have to negotiate no matter what type of CSIRT you are. And you have to consider what you want your authority to be. Next slide, please. So this slide, I like to just tie back to what we talked about last week as far as information sharing. I think that was on Wednesday. We spent a lot of time, I believe, in section 2, and what we talked about there is what does information sharing look like for you and for your organization, and what you're required to report. So going back to law enforcement, you might be required to report incidents and details of those incidents to your law enforcement or your military or government agencies. Absolutely know what those requirements are and definitely report to those folks. But I would like to just highlight that very last bullet, the other groups within your organization or maybe within your sector that you might want to spend some time developing relationships with. For example, I will just talk a little bit about your cyber intelligence team. So oftentimes the cyber intelligence team is separate from your CSIRT team. But in my last job, our goal was always to be our own best source of cyber intelligence. So we did purchase vendor intelligence, and of course we mined open source intelligence for information. Our goal, though, was to partner with our security incident response team to look at what we were actually facing, what was targeting us, and let that be our best source of intelligence. So look at who you need to partner with that can further the CSIRT's mission and their knowledge and their knowledge base and their awareness. Next slide, please. And then, of course, hire and retain the right staff. And with the pandemic going on right now, I think this is a very interesting topic. My last position, they wanted all their employees to be located in Cincinnati, Ohio. But then COVID happened, which was good for me because I don't live in Cincinnati, Ohio. And they had a much broader spectrum of talent to pull from. So the question that company faced was, do we, after almost 2 years of working remotely, is it really building on a floor, or are we okay with hiring remote staff that aren't physically located in that building on that floor? And that's a challenge for all companies moving forward. What's more important, physical location or finding the right talent wherever they are? That's a decision you and your leadership have to make on your own. I would just say that when it comes to incident response teams, I worked on an incident response team very, very early in my career. I've worked with them as partners moving forward. They work very, very hard, and they are always under a lot of pressure to figure out what is the problem, how did the problem get to us, and how can we stop the problem. So they are under a lot of stress and oftentimes feel like they are to blame for the problem, and they are not. They are in a response posture. We have to protect these people. We need to make sure they feel like they are valued. They might need to be rotated out of this position. It's important for them to get the training and the mentoring they want. And we need to ensure they know there's a path forward out of this incident response posture, which again it can be very stressful, but is very critical. And I think oftentimes companies forget to remind those employees that their response capabilities and expertise is hyper critical to an organization. Next slide, please. And I won't spend a lot of time here. We talked a little bit about this. Do you want your employees physically located? Are you okay with remote location? When it comes to what access your CSIRT team has, do they have more access to data than others? If they do, should that data be encrypted? Should physical access to an environment require badges? I mean, really a lot of this goes back to just basic facility management, facility security, but also network security. Next slide, please. If you don't mind going back one slide, I'm sorry, I would like to just highlight the very last bullet. I think preparing for emergency situations, we've talked about resiliency and recovery, but really a business continuity plan and disaster recovery plan. So there's the physical disaster recovery, and then there's the business continuity, which can be impacted by the physical disaster, but it can also be impacted by a cyber disaster. So look at the ransomware attacks we're seeing. That plan needs to be in place, and those physical disaster recovery folks really need to be working hand in hand with the cyber disaster recovery folks. And when you have a comprehensive plan, you must test the plan. You have to exercise the plan. You have to identify gaps. You have to identify pain points, and you have to work through those. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Okay, I think we will take a break here.
Tracy, do you want to answer the polling question and then we can take the break?
Yep, we can do that.
Okay, why don't we do that?
Okay, so if everyone could go to the Mentimeter and enter your responses. Okay, so the question is, what do you need to sustain your CSERT? If you can go to Mentimeter, I see a couple of answers are starting to come in. All right, so some of the answers so far: budget, senior management support. Yes, those are definitely a couple of the very first things to establish your CSERT, but they're also very important for maintaining this CSERT long term. And I see a couple of the answers that we usually teach as well. That defined authority is another thing that helps the longevity of the CSERT. See processes a couple of times. The right staff. Planning for the budget and staff. Yep, these are all great points, because what happens sometimes as CSERTs begin to get established, especially in the case of national CSERTs, you might be able to have your initial operating capability stood up, but then if any of these things are never implemented, for example, if the national CSERT never receives the appropriate level of authority to continue operating or to receive reports from the constituency, then it's very difficult to maintain operations long term. And the same for funding. So, yep, great answers, everybody.
We're almost exactly at the top of the hour. So Tracy, why don't I suggest that we now take our 10-minute break, and we'll be back at 11:10 a.m.
Sounds good.
สวัสดีค่ะแซงสกมชนะคะจะขออนุญาตประชาสัมพันธ์อีกรอบนึงนะคะค่ะท่านใดติดปัญหาหรือว่าขัดข้องใดๆในการประชุมของวันนี้นะคะสามารถแจ้งผ่านแอดมินในทางไลน์หรือว่าทางแชทของทีมแอดมินได้เลยนะคะขอบคุณค่ะ
Robin, if you're on, do you want to test audio?
Okay, thank you, everyone. We will start back up. And as soon as Tracy can tell us who is going to brief us. But let me bring the slides back up.
Okay, I think there's still some challenges, so I will take us through the next few slides, and then we'll make a slight adjustment to the agenda for tomorrow so that you don't miss out on any of the content. We will shift some things around and make it work. But picking back up here with this section is all about preparing the CSERT for action, evaluation, sustainment, and improvement. And some of those items we will wait and cover tomorrow. But in looking at the stages of CSERT development, many of the things that have already been discussed today are in those stage 1 and 2. So the things that you have to decide during the planning stage. And then with stage 3 is your initial implementation of the services and staff and those other things that you've determined in the planning stage, and then moving into the operational stage. And then once you're operational, it doesn't end there. You want to be able to evaluate your performance as a CSERT and your processes and make improvements. And so there are times, even though this graph appears linear, in some ways it can be cyclical, because you might need to come back to one of the other stages. For example, if you decide to add additional services later on, then you may come back to the planning and implementation stage. Next slide. So there's a balance also as you start to move from planning to implementation when it comes to technology. Incident management is not just about the application of technology. It's not going to solve all of your security challenges or detect every security event on its own. So you also need to complement it with a strong set of processes. So making sure that your processes are things that are consistent, repeatable, that they are quality processes, as well as measurable. So how are you going to measure whether you're doing well or not? And then they need to be understood by everyone on the team as well. If it doesn't have any benefit to have very well documented processes, but then having team members that don't follow the processes usually doesn't benefit anyone, or it definitely doesn't help during the time of an incident. Next slide.
And Tracy, I would just like to add that sometimes technology, if there's too much technology that your resources, human resources, don't understand, it's a problem.
Yeah, definitely. That can add to the challenges with maintaining personnel as well, or finding the right personnel. So having to increase the number of staff that you have in order to maintain and operate equipment can sometimes have the opposite effect of what you had intended it to have. So some of the things that we like to recommend as you are working on implementation stage. And I'm going to pause just for a moment because I believe Robin may have audio now if you want to test, and if not, we'll drive on. Okay. All right. So not hearing Robin, but I think she can hear us. So we'll keep going.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes. There you go. Would you like to finish this section?
Yes, thank you, Tracy. I apologize to everyone.
All right, and we'll stop at the summary of. Yeah.
Great. All right. So as Tracy was so eloquently saying, this slide, we're just really trying to pull the highlights out of what you have to do as you get started to maintain and sustain. And we want to make sure that we have that buy-in that we've talked about from your constituency, from your stakeholders, from your strategic partners, and also from anybody else that you're collaborating with. You want to make sure that you have a project team that's working on things. This is a little bit of an excerpt from an action list for developing a computer security incident response team that goes through so many of the things that Danelle talked about. But one of the things that is so important is always make sure you communicate with all of your stakeholders, your constituency, your partners, your strategic partners, as you're building your team, as you're announcing it and rolling it out. Without that communication and expectation setting, it can be an issue. And one thing we always say, there's a lot of services out there. We showed you many slides that have multiple different services. Don't ever think you have to do all of them. You want to start small, do a few services very well, and then expand and grow. And don't ever worry about asking people for help. The community is out there, and there are resources that you can use. People may share their format for a ConOps, for policies, incident reporting forms. Reuse is good as long as you give attribution to the people that you are using from. Next slide, please.
One quick comment, everyone, you'll be able to get copies of these slides, so don't worry about having to memorize this list really quickly.
And the problems that we've seen as far as common problems, of course, are the opposite of some of those things that we said. That failure, we've seen that happen where all the right people weren't asked, and so they missed a key activity or they missed a key stakeholder. There weren't the foundational policies and procedures in place, so people weren't sure of how to conduct their activities. Too many services, we've watched time and time again, a CSIRT take on too many services. And you also have to watch that unrealistic expectations or the mismatched expectations. Management may think you can do many more things than you can with the staff and funding you have. So from the beginning, you have to be able to lay out what you can do in the current situation and how you can move forward. So those are some of the common problems that we've seen. Next slide, please.
Robin, if I could just add on, just from a practical perspective or someone who was there, management will push and push for everything. And that's why it's so important for your mission statement and your playbook to say, these are our service level agreements, and these are the services we can provide, because our incident response capability, they're under the gun, they have a lot to do, and it takes a lot to provide a really robust incident response capability. So Protect
Thank
your
you.
employees.
Next slide, please. And just over the years that the CERT Coordination Center at the SEI has been in place, some of the key lessons that we've learned are specifically trustworthiness. You must build that trustworthiness. You'll live and die by your credibility and by your relationships that you built. Have that code of conduct. Ensure people don't violate a confidence. Only deal in facts. And don't be afraid to say, I don't know, but I will find out. Where you can share, you want to look at sharing, but you always want to make sure you're following your rules and regulations and protecting your sensitive data. As we said, all teams are different. All CSERTs are different. You have to recognize that. You have to understand and meet on expectations and definitions. But most we see teams saying things can be done faster than they can be done. Things take time. Building up and the trust and the recognition in your constituency can take a year to 2 years. And it's all going to depend on how you act, how you communicate, and how you can show your value. And this is going to be happening for a very long time. So as Danelle was saying, you have to look at doing this long term and what that means for your funding, your staff, retention and caring, and building those relationships with other experts who can help when you need assistance and you need additional analysis. So just some of the things to keep in mind. And the last slide for this section, next slide, that there are a lot of teams out there that can provide assistance, and there are a lot of organizations that can help you.
But before I go to that slide, I would note that on your slide about lessons learned, in the title it says CERT, and in the document it talks about CSERTs. Can you explain, are there differences between CERTs and CSERTs, or do they mean the same thing?
CERT CC is actually our team at the CERT division at the Software Engineering Institute, the CERT Coordination Center. So different teams have different names. The word CERT is a name that people often will use instead of the term CSERT. CSERT is kind of very generic. Very often in the international community, you'll see people use the CERT term, but it's all the same as far as CSERTs can be the same. And remember, it's not the name, it's the functions. The monitoring, detection, analysis, response, recovery, after action, and all the preparation to be in place for that. So that's why we often talk about an incident management capability. Did that answer your question, Barbara?
Yep, thank you. That's a great explanation. So here's your assistance.
And so there are many different organizations that are out there to help CSERTs. And don't forget that you can reach out to them from different areas, and that you might want to take a look at what the form of incident response and security teams can offer. So, thank you. And I'll turn it back to you, Barbara.
Did you want to cover your last slide about key points?
Sure. And these just, again, focus on a lot of the things we said throughout this module, that we want to make sure that we understand the teams come in all different varieties, their mission and goals are different, their constituency may be different, their title and name may be different, and the types of services they offer may be very different. And we have to understand that and set those expectations. But most important is that term of incident management starts before an incident occurs. You must have your preparations in place, especially the different things that Danelle went through. You have to be ready for action and ready to execute those services you've defined, but with flexibility and being able to adjust to new things that come your way.
Great. Thank you, Robin. And for everyone, We will pick this up tomorrow when we start talking about measuring incident response and resiliency readiness, progress and readiness. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to switch back to our lessons learned and bring in our next session of Mr. Dingbang and see what we've learned from what was presented today. Joanna, do you want to? I think Rick is going to bring up the slides for this.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. We have a team effort tonight. Rick is going to bring up our slides. And while he is doing that, I will just give a quick review for any of you who were not with us or who need a refresher on where we left our cast of characters. So we started this scenario understanding that Mr. Dingbang is a manager in the cybersecurity agency in his home country. He's responsible for outreach to critical infrastructure owners and operators. And Barbara, it looks like Rick is now struggling with the screen share. Do you think you could try to pop that up?
Yep. I'm going to.
Thank you. Mr. Dingbang is really trying to keep a handle on outreach to his sector stakeholders, but we know that he is overworked. He has a lot on his plate, and we learned that he might not be taking too much of a strategic risk approach, but we gave him some suggestions to address that. In our session 2, where we learned about stakeholder management and building bonds between critical infrastructure and other entities, our story got a little bit more complicated when the health sector became a key player in Mr. Dingbang's life, and his good friend, Miss Sabai, who is a hospital administrator, experienced some real concerns with ransomware in her sector. Then last session, we learned about national incident response plans, and we saw Mr. Dingbang go up his chain of command to try to improve the nation intergovernmental response. We also learned last time that Mr. Kim is the head of the K-CERT, which is the national cybersecurity incident response team. So tonight we are actually going to pick up with Mr. Kim and have a shift in our story and hear about what the C-CERT is up to. So while Mr. Dingbang works through his chain of authority to try and address the health sector issue, Mr. Kim is trying to do the same. Mr. Kim's K-CERT is a new organization, having been stood up within the last 5 years. The K-CERT is sponsored by and financially dependent on its sponsor, the Ministry of ICT, but it does not have officially sanctioned authority to task or regulate its constituents. K-CERT is operationally responsible for federal government networks and has a coordinating role as the national point of contact for domestic and international stakeholders. The tremendous increase in cyber incident activity during the COVID-19 pandemic has left Mr. Kim's team stretched thin. They are racing to answer the calls and requests that have been coming in from private industry members in Cunardra, while at the same time trying to fulfill their responsibilities to manage government networks. Mr. Kim makes an appointment with his deputy minister to request state of crisis support, any additional authorities or resources that are critically necessary for his team to continue meeting the needs of the nation. So with that, let's go to our first Menti poll. Barbara, if you wouldn't mind switching your screen. So we're asking, what activities do you suggest that Mr. Kim try to accomplish now? So we're looking for immediate activities to help respond to incidents in the sector. And I'm going to ask you to think about the CERT resiliency management model that you saw today, the first services framework that you saw today, and also thinking back to our previous sessions. What do you suggest Mr. Kim try to accomplish now? And we'll give you a moment to respond. And yes, we can see the poll, Barbara, just waiting for some responses to come in.
Thank you.
So I'm going to give you a hint and tell you that the next question, we're going to focus on more strategic or longer term efforts that Mr. Kim can try to accomplish. But for now, we want to think about what can he do today. We learned that he has limited authority in the sector. We learned that he too is stretched thin. But what are some activities that he can try to accomplish now, knowing what we know about the ransomware issues?
Joanna, what do we know about K-CERT? We learned tonight that there's so many different C-CERT models. And do we have a sense of what kind of model he's working with?
Yeah, so we know that he has a sponsor, a financial head agency. That's the Ministry of ICT. And we can note that that's different than who Mr. Dingbang works for, which is the cybersecurity agency. We know that it's a small team. We know that they've only been in business for about 5 years. We don't know a lot more than that about the services that he provides, but we do know that they have a responsibility to manage and secure government network systems data, and that they have an outreach role. So we have some responses coming in here. Request immediate support, coordinate with Mr. Dingbang. Excellent. That gets into our stakeholder engagement and our constituency. Contact with the responsible person of Mr. Dingbang. Partner with Mr. Dingbang, that's right. Set up a working group. Robin or Tracy, would you like to comment on some of the things we're seeing and maybe some immediate actions that you would also recommend?
Sure, Joanne. Thank you. I think that definitely some of the things that have come up here tie into some of the things we talked about from session 3. So that, like, setting up a working group or a crisis management team, pulling in any additional staff that you might be able to pull in to help. And I think about some of the things we mentioned on last week, as far as, you know, putting together an alert or an advisory that can go out to people, that a frequently asked questions document that can be made available on the websites or shared. And then really looking at that surge support, I think that some people have mentioned here. And especially I see a couple people saying, reach out to the healthcare sector. And I think that that's going to come up in one of the other questions too, like who can they work with to get help. So I think that the people that are answering are really pulling in some really good activities to do right now.
Yeah, excellent. And we're also remembering that, we're kind of coming into this conversation or into this scenario inject at that containment, eradication, and recovery phase. Right now, we haven't been able to influence or inform Mr. Kim's perspective in the prepare or detect or analysis phases, or triage or analysis. So those are just some things to keep in mind, that we're kind of starting a little maybe behind where ideally we would like to. But certainly that doesn't mean that there's nothing that Mr. Kim can do, as we're seeing here with all of these fantastic suggestions here. Okay, let's go to our next question here. So let me see. There we go. So which activities do you suggest Mr. Kim try to accomplish in the long term or longer term? So these are going to be more strategic activities. Think about strategic planning. Now we're thinking about, okay, there are some things he can do immediately because there's this significant issue in the sector without a lot of additional resources. But what could he try to do in the long term? And we saw some of those in the last question. So I'm going to ask you to maybe plug those in here again so we can discuss those in more detail. And I believe I saw something in the meeting chat. Let me just check that quickly while you respond. Okay. I see Captain Jadette had a comment for the participants. Okay, yeah, we see your comment, Captain Jadette. Barbara is on top of that. Thank you. Okay, so longer term activities. So I'm going to ask you to think about the range of services that we discussed tonight. Again, thinking back to the models that we learned, thinking back to our other sessions, longer term activities. And while those are coming in, Matt, would you like to take a stab at this one?
Sure, thanks. I'm excited also to see if the system works. Oh, it does. That's handy. So this one's a little bit complicated because, as we learned, Mr. Dingbang is with the ISD, right, the Infrastructure Security Division, and Mr. Kim doesn't have the resources really or the authorities, to influence a significant cyber event. So on the longer term, I think I would lay out some activities that would develop those lines of communication and incident response and the incident response plan. Already know what national resources are available and have a process that can reallocate these teams and resources, based on the incident severities that we talked about in the last couple of weeks. Because we heard in the session today that it really comes down to influence, relationships, lines of communication. And, during a crisis isn't the time to really develop those. So I would develop an incident response plan, kind of working for worst case scenario, exercise it. And
I
think we just lost Matt.
Yes, I think we did lose Matt. That's been an exciting evening. Completely agree with Matt's points. And I think one key issue that he brought up is that it's always more difficult in a crisis scenario. And those longer term efforts, the relationship building, the trust building, the stakeholder engagement activities, if those are not well on their way in what we might call day to day or in peacetime, for lack of a better term, it can only hurt our attempts at coordination in a crisis if those relationships aren't well planned, thought out, documented, and exercised. Matt, I see you are back. Did you want to just finish your thought there? I think we heard you up till your point on exercising.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, it kind of popped in and out on me there too. The last piece I wanted to talk about was it's common that there's an organization that has authority on government networks and organizations that have authority on their own critical infrastructure networks because they also own the data. So a good practice is that when there's not an event, to set up this coordination center of the stakeholders that have authority on the commercial networks and the stakeholders that have authorities in the government, so that they can collaborate, pass information, and even pass intelligence during these events.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I think there's a lot to dig in here in longer term approach. And Tracy or Robin or Danelle, I'm wondering if you could maybe comment on some prioritization. So we've heard a lot of great things or excellent points in our Menti poll. Matt brought up several ideas. There is a lot that Mr. Kim could try to do. But if he really had to focus, knowing what we know, which is limited context, what would you maybe suggest he may want to think about first, or at least earlier in his longer term planning?
I don't want to take away from Danelle and Tracy if they wanted to add or say something. But some of the things, because he already has, a team set up, so it's more that for him, he's going to have to look at those things that are not in place. And for his situation, my thoughts are that they need to resolve some things with at least clarifying what the authority is, because that was an issue that came up. Mm-hmm. And they need to look, I think, at the way that they're going to share information and also the way they're going to coordinate incident response. Because they don't have that long-term national incident response plan, they don't seem to have a more coordinated approach at their level either, as far as how they can work together or provide surge support for each other. So he's not necessarily having to start from scratch, but he needs to take a look at what is currently in place, where the problems or gaps are, and that are of the highest impact, what more activity or what more improvements would bring the best impact to situations like this. And I think some of that clear coordinations and communication channels, establishing how you're going to work together, and who's going to be the contact people, so that if something like this happens again, they can handle it better and faster. But I do want to also add, Joanna, that I'm very, very pleased to see that in the responses people are giving are so many of the things that we talked about tonight.
Yeah, I agree, Robin. Excellent, excellent point. Okay, let's go on to our next question here, where we're going to ask you which stakeholders other than government have a shared responsibility to try and get this ransomware epidemic under control. So who should be part of this shared effort? And actually, let's, there were some pretty good comments in the last question that had some interesting government or government-related stakeholders who may want to be a part of something like a working group. So let's just alter this a little bit. Let's just say what stakeholders have a shared responsibility to try and get this ransomware epidemic under control. We've heard a lot about the Cybersecurity Agency, and we've heard a lot about the, we're learning about the K-CERT. We've heard a little bit about one couple of stakeholders in the health sector, but who else? Whether other government representatives or institutions or the private sector, maybe even the general public in some way. Who do you think could be part of a shared effort? Insurance companies, interesting. Yeah, cyber insurance is an interesting field. I think there's a little ways to go there. Actuary information just is not quite robust enough, but certainly getting there. Technical vendors. Each hospital in the hospital sector or in the healthcare sector. Academia, that is a good response, maybe from a research and development perspective. Let's see what else we have. Of course, the CSERT. Regional CSERTs and sector CSERTs, absolutely. We saw those in our one of our earlier polls. Possibly information sharing and analysis centers. All sectors, certainly, if we're seeing that ransomware bleed outside of just healthcare and affect other sectors, which I think would be a real world experience. So, Barbara, I'm going to ask you this question because this relates to our first session. All of these stakeholders have potential input. All hospitals, the private sector, the health sector, and the CSERTs, and the regional CSERTs, and the sector CSERTs. Can you speak a little bit to how that strategic risk management approach might help Mr. Kim narrow down and focus who to speak to first, and who may be at the top of his engagement list to try and pursue that shared responsibility?
Certainly. I think there's a couple things. One is in that so understanding which are the critical assets are really, really important. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, looking at the assessments. We talked about the threat assessments, understanding who the actors are and who's behind it. And so whether in fact it's a nation state type actor or whether it's a criminal actor, what intent they have, what capability they have, is really important to understand what kind of response is needed to deal with that kind of actor. The interesting thing I'm looking at in terms of the answers here, that nobody has indicated that I can see law enforcement, that that could be a place or a participant, a stakeholder that might be helpful here. And so I think it really is trying to figure out who are the threat actors and who has the capabilities to address the particular TTPs of those particular actors, that will be critical to understand how do you address that particular piece. We also know with the vulnerability assessments, determining where the vulnerabilities are, which are based on the TTPs, the techniques and procedures that are being used by the particular actors. So all of these are pieces that we can go back to figure out what's causing the problem. And someone's got their mic open, so I'm hearing the echo. But so I think it's going back to sort of those basics that can help understand. And then in session number 2, we had Travis and Rick talk about, identifying the stakeholders and who are the critical stakeholders and making sure that they're talking to the right stakeholders who could be here. And it could be not only the stakeholders or the health stakeholders, but the other stakeholders, which could be everything from law enforcement to government to elsewhere.
Thanks, Barbara. We are down to our last few minutes. Let's go ahead and just quickly do our last question for the evening. If we could go to our last conversation. So this is going to fall into that longer term or more strategic planning for Mr. Kim. I'm going to ask you to think about, again, all of the sessions that we've discussed, but what governance mechanisms, so law, regulation, policy, or voluntary measures could be helpful to any of Mr. Kim's efforts that we have been discussing tonight. So it's not unusual in situations like what we've learned with Mr. Ding Bang and Mr. Kim, when things get overwhelming, sometimes authorities can say, we're going to regulate this, we're going to force this effort, we're going to write into law that sector businesses must comply with a set of cybersecurity requirements. And those can sometimes be difficult to audit, difficult to uphold. And so we're always looking for a system that blends the right legislation at that national level, the right regulations, whether those are for consumer protection or for economic development, the right policies, again, drawing back to who has authority, plus the right voluntary measures. There are these, in many cases, infrastructure owners and operators are private industries. They may not be state owned. They may not have any connection to a national government. And that's a space that requires public-private partnership and voluntary measures. So I'm going to ask you to think about how those might be helpful, or where you might choose one over the other. And Barbara, I'm going to turn to you again, since you are our resident law and policy and regulatory SME for the evening. Would you like to comment on any of that?
Well, so I think having in place, and this is some of the things that Robin and Danelle and Tracy talked about, is having these authorities in place in advance so that you know what you can and can't do. But having rules in place that allow sharing of information could be critical. Having policies in place where you have access to the kinds of information that you need. And I'm off the top of my head, that's where I'm at. I'm sorry, I don't have more for you right now. I'm trying to multitask. I'm afraid.
Understood, of course. Of course. All excellent responses. I think we're seeing this blend of law and regulation. All could be helpful in different ways. One comment that in a crisis stage, we're really looking at voluntary measures. It's probably not the time to write policies or try to enact regulation, which is very insightful. But all in all, I think we're seeing that all of these can be helpful. Comment on maybe in the longer term, including a Personal Data Protection Act. We haven't talked about data protection and privacy yet, but that's an excellent point. And yes, all should be kind of set in place early on or in early stages to set the right foundation. So excellent responses. Thank you, everyone. We will pick up our characters again tomorrow, and thanks for your great participation. Barbara, I will turn it to you.
Thank you, Joanna. We're running late, so I think I won't go to the Mentimeter poll on objectives at this point in time. I just want to, again, thank everybody for your patience with all our technical difficulties tonight. But given your answers to all the questions with the adventures of Mr. Dingbang, it's clear that you listened carefully and learned a lot from the session. And so we're grateful to see that. And then tomorrow night we will pick up. We will talk more about being incident resiliency and readiness. Some things that we had hoped to talk about tonight, but ran out of time because of some of the technical difficulties. But we'll pick that up tomorrow night, and then we will continue on with building a coordination center. So again, thank you for joining. I know normally that Captain Jadette would speak to you in Thai at this point in time, but unfortunately his mic is not working. And so he won't be able to join us to be able to close this out. So let me again just say thank you all for joining. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow when we go to session 5. Thank you.